Welcome to the Long COVID podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long COVID podcast. I am so excited to be joined tonight by Todd Davenport, and we are going to dive into the mystical, magical world of post-exertional malaise, and I'm sure other things as well. So a very, very warm welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say, now that the recording is going, thank you for all that you've done in the manner of taking a very practical approach to identifying topics that are important for the community of people who are living with long COVID and approaching them in a really personable way with really reliable folks that you've brought onto the podcast. So congratulations on what you've done, and thanks for having me as part of all that.
Oh, thank you so much. It is absolutely my pleasure. So would you mind just saying a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do?
Yeah, so I am a physiotherapist. We would maybe call it a physical therapist here in the U.S. So for some people, that's strike one. First strike against me is that I'm a physio, and that I'm a physiotherapy professor here in the United States at the University of the Pacific School of Health Sciences in Stockton, California, which is east of San Francisco, for folks who are wondering kind of where that is on the map. I'm an exercise scientist, so that's strike two for some people, because as we'll talk about, exercise is one of those, physical exertion is one of those types of exertion that makes people sometimes feel worse who have long COVID. But I promise that I've tried to sort of learn a lot over my time being a physio, almost 25 years, yikes. And in my time studying myalgic encephalomyelitis and now long COVID, for about 15 years, which sounds like a lot of time too, actually saying it out loud, in order to really bring some good information about what physical exertion does to the body. You know, if you have a certain type of long COVID that mirrors myalgic encephalomyelitis, that is called post-exertional malaise, would be the clinical hallmark that we're going to talk about mostly today. And take those physiological insights to really try and understand what to do next.
And what did bring you into the world of, MECFS originally, and obviously now we've added long COVID to that pile. But yeah, what sort of brought you into that world?
Like everything, a long story. My story started being an athlete. And being very curious about why athletes made mental mistakes when they were tired. I played basketball. I was wondering why people made decisions or sort of didn't execute certain fundamentals, with fatigue as a factor. So when I got to college, I did my honors thesis in exercise science on doing neurocognitive games before and after a fatiguing bicycle task. Interestingly enough, I chose my teammates from the swim team who were very fit, and it took them a long time to get fatigued. So that was a learning lesson right there. We were there trying to get them fatigued for a long time. And then kind of rolled that experience into into additional kind of preclinical experiences as a student athletic trainer working with athletes, then as a physiotherapy student, doing some work at our U.S. National Institutes of Health, looking into, how we test people who have health conditions characterized by fatigue. And then, fast forward a few years, when I joined University of the Pacific, I was sort of doing a a Google search about who was in my neighborhood, I found this thing on campus called the Pacific Fatigue Lab. And I thought, well, I've done some things with fatigue, a little bit about it. And of course, as is my habit, just sort of wandered over there unannounced and knocked on the door. And thankfully they opened it. And there I met the Pacific Fatigue Lab team, Stacy Stevens, Dr. Mark Van Ness, Dr. Chris Snell, and Jared Stevens, and have really worked with them ever since. That group has since kind of gone on, and Stacy founded the Workwell Foundation. So I continue on as a scientific advisor to the Workwell Foundation. So that is my long and wandering path into this content area. And as you point out, we've done some work with, in particular, cardiopulmonary exercise testing, and specifically 2-day cardiopulmonary exercise testing to really try and understand the metabolic, the cardiac, the pulmonary consequences of physical exertion in people with ME, and have since rolled that work into long COVID as a subset, fairly sizable subset of people with long COVID start to resemble people with ME.
Yeah, because I think what, someone like me who got long COVID back in 2020 and, suddenly was like, what fresh hell is this? And then, we start noticing links between MECFS, long COVID, and other things as well that have been around for much, much longer. And I think I had a couple of friends with ME, and I thought, oh, I get it. And then you get it yourself and you're like, oh no, I didn't get that at all. And you can't understand unless you've had that experience of it, I think. And I think, the post-exertional malaise kind of angle of it as well is something that's very difficult to understand. I think irregular people, they push themselves super hard, they go run a marathon and they feel tired the next day. And like that is normal. But the idea of like getting out of bed to brush your teeth and that knocking you out for a week, that is something that is very hard to understand unless you have actually had that experience of it. So maybe before we dive down the rabbit hole too far, can we just talk about what post-exertional malaise actually is? And it's probably not just one thing, which is probably the hard thing about it, isn't it?
It is. And so as you so beautifully set up, I think the average person understands what fatigue is. The average person has been tired, whether they've, physically overexerted, they've overexerted over a period of time, not slept well. When I tell people that I'm, an exercise scientist and a physiotherapist that has been interested in chronic fatigue, just to kind of boil things down and try and use the popular parlance, the most common thing I hear is, oh, yeah, thanks for studying that. I get tired too. And you're like, no, you don't know. This is not a cup of coffee and a lie down kind of fatigue. This is not, back off on your training a little bit. The gym, you've been hitting it too hard, and you'll feel better. In fact, I've stopped saying that I'm interested in chronic fatigue just for that reason, because the focus on fatigue oversimplifies what post-exertional malaise is. And post-exertional malaise is really a multi-system, multi-symptom kind of just constellation of experiences that occur after exertion. So it's not just fatigue, and let's just talk about the fatigue since that's the one that people kind of know about. This is the feeling of bonked, the feeling of nothing left, the feeling of I cannot get out of bed or off this couch. My body will not let me do it. I have worked with marathon runners who have post-exertional malaise, and they will tell you that the feeling of finishing a marathon and post-exertional malaise are not equivalent feelings, that post-exertional malaise is worse. And part of what makes it worse are the associated signs and symptoms that go along with this. Cognitive dysfunction, which is very troubling because it limits short-term memory and attention. It inhibits, short-term learning. there's also sleep impairment that goes with this, going asleep, staying asleep, quality of sleep once you are asleep, all crummy, widespread body pains, numbness and tingling, headaches, shortness of breath and palpitations, issues with gastrointestinal, with digestion, maybe with genitourinary tract disturbances. All of these signs and symptoms occur in response to some kind of an exposure, an exertion. Could be physical exertion, which is, if you follow me on Twitter or if you listen to some of the other podcasts I've done, you'll hear me talk a lot about physical exertion because I'm a physio and I'm an exercise scientist. But that's not to discount the importance of cognitive exertion, where even watching a video on, a screen, on an small screen, an iPad, so forth, a short video is enough to provoke signs and symptoms. Also, the exertions include environmental exertions, or environmental exposures, so scents and smells and odors and chemicals. People can be oversensitive to those as well. So there's a whole host of exertions that kind of go into this post-exertional malaise. And I do want to point out that there are some folks that dispute this idea of malaise because, first, it's sort of an old-timey word that people don't really use anymore. And people think it runs the risk of underselling what this is. Because malaise is sort of like defined as like feeling off because you're ill. And so probably the conceptualization that best captures post-exertional malaise doesn't even use that word. It's the International Consensus Criteria for Myalgic Encephalomyelitis, which was written in 2011. And it uses this term post-exertional neuroimmune exhaustion. And it kind of gives this sense of the exhaustion piece, which kind of gets at the fatigue plus that we were just talking about. And then also kind of starts to pull together some of the suspected underlying etiology of these signs and symptoms under the neurological system and the immune system. So in post-exertional neuroimmune exhaustion, there are several types to this. So how do you know you have this? The first is that you might have this really marked decline in your physical and cognitive capabilities in response to an exertion. The other is that the symptoms that reliably follow an exertion. There are stages, there are levels to this, and we can link in the show notes immediate post-exertional malaise, short-term and long-term post-exertional malaise, but there's generally a lag time involved of 24 to even 72 hours. And that there's a prolonged recovery period, and that often people have a decreased threshold for their physical and their mental performance. And so those are the general aspects of post-exertional neuroimmune exhaustion that we call post-exertional malaise. And honestly, we only call it that because everyone calls it that. And we have to find a common language.
Yeah, and I guess it's, you hear people talk about this all the time with brain fog is the one that often comes up where, brain fog is a sort of like a very friendly term for something that is not so friendly in what it feels like. But it is the word that is used, and people, I don't know if they understand it, but they certainly, hear it. And I guess PEM and post-exertional malaise is kind of the same, isn't it? Where it doesn't quite give the scale of what it is, but is there anything that really could give the scale of what that is? That's kind of quite difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, if there is, I don't know what it would be. Because here's the thing is I'm always struck by how profoundly people need to fake being well just to work with me as a healthcare practitioner. And some people have a really good poker face that they can I'm always gauging, sort of, are the words getting in? Are the thoughts coming back reasonably, associated or collected? Does it look like the person's just kind of fading out on me, and they're kind of have that thousand mile stare past the camera, past me, and So I'm always looking for nonverbals that are associated with an increase in cognitive dysfunction. But you're totally right. I don't know how we capture this in a word.
We'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us. So we sort of learn to track this ourselves, as we go through this experience. And okay, well, yesterday I did this thing and today I'm feeling absolutely awful. And you start to make the links. Okay, well, this has happened before when I did that thing and this happened. Okay, I think maybe I have PEM, this is start, you start to recognize those patterns. But yeah, what is physically going on in the body when that happens? What do we know about that?
There's so many things that are going on. And so I'm going to, just in the interest of time, and sort of sticking within the confines of what I know the best, I'm going to talk about post-exertional malaise as an energy production problem by the body. Post-exertional malaise, as I mentioned, is a lot of things. It's an immune system problem. It's a circulatory problem. It is a hormonal problem, and a bunch of things that I'm leaving out. But it is at its core also an energy production and utilization problem. And so I'm gonna paraphrase a load of exercise physiology studies into a silly analogy that I like to use, and that's the analogy of the plug-in hybrid car. So your body works like a plug-in hybrid car, come to find out after all of this. So in a plug-in hybrid car, you have two fuel sources. You have a gas motor and you have a battery. And the gas motor is great for things like, going freeway speeds and going up and down hills and hauling people and gear in your car. And the battery is great for stop and go traffic, lower speed, kind of city driving, so forth. And that the gas motor can charge the battery, so you don't have to plug it in as much. So that's nice. So this is similar to, your gas motor kind of being your aerobic metabolism. This is a very kind of your long-term energy system. It generates a lot of power for you, a lot of energy, allows you to do prolonged things, allows you to do kind of higher intensity things. And then you have your short-term energy system, kind of your creatine phosphate. These are sort of your early, kind of glycolytic pathways, just metabolizing what's on hand in your muscle cells. And those are like your battery. So let's imagine now that you're a plug-in hybrid car and that your gas motor doesn't work, or that your gas motor is unreliable. So what do you lose? Well, you lose the ability to do prolonged things. You lose the ability to go up and down hills, higher intensity things, hauling people and gear. You also lose the ability to charge the battery. And so you over-rely on the battery, leaving you potentially stuck at the side of the road, which is simulating a crash. So, you do all this work and you realize that it's your body works just like other things that we've engineered for our convenience. And so I want to acknowledge Dr. Chris Snell, who introduced us to this analogy, and that I've tried to kind of add to and refine over time. So now what you do next is try to avoid overusing your battery.
And you know what? I think, the analogies, they're great because they're putting it into a sort of a situation that people understand. And that makes it relatable to understand what's going on in your own body and for someone else to understand what's going on with you, like a friend or a family member or a employer or whoever it is that you're trying to kind of explain what is going on. And they don't get it because why would they? And you're trying to find this language to explain it in something that they will understand. And that's very difficult to do because there's sort of limited crossover for someone who hasn't had that experience. So I think that's great. I think that's very relatable. Even if they're not mechanics, will kind of understand the sort of the basics of how a car works.
Yeah. And oh gosh, I am not a mechanic. So if you probed any farther on how a plug-in hybrid car works, I would be unsuccessful. I would not be the person to help.
So you mentioned earlier that post-exertional malaise can show up in people from sort of 24 hours to 72 hours-ish. And it's different in different people. I think it's different in different circumstances. There's definitely been times where I thought I got away with it and then got hit 12 hours later and was like, oh, damn it. So do we know why the time lag is different in different people? Is there any kind of knowledge on that?
Not totally sure, but I would suspect that it has to do with some of the underlying bioenergetic impairments that we see in people with post-exertional malaise. In that some of the chemicals, this is kind of the biochemical take now, some of the chemicals that are used in the cycle of creating energy molecules become depleted. And I think it has to do with the relative depletion and timing of recovery of some of those. Now, obviously, we're taking a very narrow view just for the purposes of sort of time and convenience and the limitations of your guest. But there probably are other systemic impairments that also are associated with that or involved in that time lag. So the short answer is I'm not sure. But again, as we think about post-exertional malaise as lots of things, but among those things, an energy production problem probably has something to do with those chemicals being in short supply and how quickly they can become recovered or regenerated.
Of course, because no system in the body is working in isolation, is it? It's connected to everything else and everyone's, makeup of all of those systems and how they interact with each other is going to be very different and is probably going to be different on different days as well.
Absolutely. So as we think about the whole person, putting my clinical hat on for a minute, really the only constant with post-exertional malaise is variation. Variation between people, variation between days, variation between months, variation between different phases of a recovery process, and so forth. So there's just a lot of variation.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the frustrations, isn't it? Because even within your limitations that you are having to come to terms with having, it's not like it's always the same. It's like, okay, on this day I can do that, but on that day I can do half of that. And then 2 weeks later I might be able to do a bit more, but then a month after that I'm right back down the bottom again. And it's like, I can't work with this.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a little bit like trying to nail Jello to the wall, right? It's just not going to work very well. Jello is just going to slide down and do its own thing. From a clinical perspective, it's very similar because even with clinicians who work with people who have chronic health conditions, there's sort of like some general linearity to a plan, but there's just when you're working with someone who has post-exertional malaise, that linearity goes out the window. So everyone's trying to nail different flavors of Jello to the wall to try and figure out the patterns and how things work. But I think the overall the unifying theme is to try and figure out your capacity. Try and figure out where that gas motor kicks in, at what level of exertion that is, and how much of that gas motor you can depend on for how long, and then try and stay within that. Now, Dr. Leonard Jason, a few years ago, called this the energy envelope, which is a common term that people use to try and figure out what that capacity is. And really, all the energy envelope means is to try and figure out what your resources are on a given day and then to stay within those resources. And, allocating a certain portion of those resources, if you can, to almost bank for yourself. So not constantly redlining, to the very edge of what you can do, but to sort of try and maintain a little bit for the benefit of your own recovery, which is hard, because now what you're trying to do is you're trying to sell people on, number one, doing less, which I'll make an additional comment about in a moment. But the second thing that you're trying to sell people on is you're going to have them stop short of their capacity, even if they feel good, just to kind of give themselves permission to feel good later. But I want to go back to this idea of doing nothing. Staying in your energy envelope, or what we might call pacing, is far from doing nothing. It's balancing activities with rest, and it takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of figuring, where you are now, where you've been, where you're going to be, what you have to do. It takes a lot of prioritizing. And resting actually takes a heck of a lot of work for people. Resting is not an easy thing to do. This is not like chill out and watch trashy TV. This is usually somewhere between being awake and being asleep, because you're trying to minimize cognitive exertion. Tends to be pretty boring, tends to be very isolating, and it's just hard. So as a clinician, a lot of what I do is try and help people sort through their pacing plans and try and figure out where this energy envelope is and strategies to stay within it. Again, balancing activity with rest, but also managing things like isolation and trying to manage things like boredom, and trying to manage things like frustration, because this is really hard stuff to do. So oftentimes, people think of pacing as being something less, but it actually turns out to be a boatload of work.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, yeah, balance is something that I've really started to appreciate in my life. On the other side is that, yeah, it's great to have those days where you do all the things, but actually you need to balance that out. And actually, someone told me back, a couple of years ago that pacing was a skill for life. And I was just like, no, I'm looking forward to never having to pace again. And now I'm thinking, it's a totally different thing, when you don't have something like long COVID, but it is something that's still sort of useful to hang on to in some ways, I think. Maybe an umbrella sort of overriding kind of thing rather than maybe more specifically.
Yeah, and long COVID is new, so we're still trying to get a handle on it. And so I just sort of assume that pacing is a life skill. I couldn't agree more strongly. I would say it's just a core competency of living with long COVID. And it's the thing that I teach first. People may come and ask me, I want to exercise. How do I exercise? Well, how's your pacing? What's pacing? Okay, we're starting there first. So we're going to back up a few steps and just kind of make sure that that people understand the potential warning signs of overdoing and have a plan for what happens if they overdo. So those are really, really important things. I think of my clinical practice with people who have long COVID and who are trying to manage despite post-exertional malaise as being more along the lines of a health coaching model. Now, health coaching is, trying to help people make a behavior change that we commonly think of as more exercise. But I'm thinking less exercise, and I'm thinking more pacing, and striving towards this balance, and how people can best achieve that balance. Now, some folks who have, maybe less severe involvement, there's a little more capacity to have a balance. But there are some people who are severe, very severe, who their balance is rolling in bed, and that's it, or making it to a trip to the bathroom. So that balance looks very different, and the capacity for that balance looks very different in people. So I don't want to give the sense that one size fits all, because remember, the whole idea here is that variability is the only constant.
Yeah, absolutely. And like what you were saying a moment ago about the warning signs, I think that was something that was like a total light bulb moment for me because, I would do a thing, crash, do a thing, crash. And then when I started to notice, okay, what does it feel like just before? I go over the edge. And then when I started to notice what that kind of felt like, okay, this is the moment where I can stop. Maybe I can intervene. Maybe I can do some breathing. Maybe I can lay down, whatever that looked like. And not all the time, because I wasn't always very good at it. And sometimes you're not able to stop. If you're in a car and you're in a traffic jam, you can't just close your eyes and lie down. But being much more aware of what that felt like and what I could do was huge for me, because there's so much about what you can't do when you're unwell with something like this. It's can't. And then once you find the can, it's like, okay, I have this tiny, tiny bit of control sometimes. And yeah, for me personally, that was absolutely massive.
Yeah, we're always trying. So this balance of activity with rest is prioritized based on, the person who's living with long COVID. As a clinician, ideally, I don't go in with goals for people. People set their own goals. And if we're fortunate to have this situation where people have a little more energy, and that's very common, that people do improve with pacing. There's always a limit. There's always a system to work within that's different for every patient, but people do improve with adherence to a pacing program. In fact, there was a nice study that was put out just recently in people with long COVID, suggesting that pacing can be beneficial, and that greater adherence to a pacing program is predictive of better outcomes. So, but what you do with that energy is up to you. Shouldn't be up to your clinician. So if you're working with a clinician that wants you to, hey, you're feeling better, hop on the bike. Well, we know that in people with post-exertional malaise, the acute responses to exercise are abnormal. The response to graded exercise has not been favorable, not been favorable enough for it to be favored in clinical practice guidelines. So it's not. And so I would almost prefer, people, if you had it in you to go, to do something, let's find out what that looks like for you. Sort of in what duration, in what intensity makes sense, what are the warning signs of overdoing, and so it becomes a greater conversation. So I would just beware of the clinician who has you hop on the treadmill because you're having a good day, because it's a slippery slope towards an intervention that doesn't help, potentially harms, and does not put you in the middle of the decision making about how best to spend your energy.
We'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm just jumping in for a second to see if you're enjoying this episode. If you're finding it useful, maybe you would consider sharing it somewhere, a friend, a group, or even on your Twitter feed. If everyone was able to share just once, we'd be able to get this information out to even more people who really, really need it. So please consider sharing somewhere if you possibly can. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thank you so much.
Yeah, and you know what? I think what is important to people is going to differ depending on the person. Some people, exercise and movement is a very important part of their life. So maybe they do want to spend some of their energy going for a walk, or whatever that movement is going to look like for them. Whereas you mentioned earlier all the different types of energy, your cognitive, your physical, your emotional, your whatever the other ones were. And actually for some people maybe it's going to spend some time with their family, or watching their kids at the play park, or reading a book, or whatever that is. And I think, as you say, that's got to be down to the person. I think it's important that they understand that all of these things do take energy, but ultimately what they decide to spend their energy on, it shouldn't really be pre-prescribed by someone who isn't them.
That's it.
You mentioned earlier, I think, the CPET. I think one of the many kind of frustrations with something like long COVID is the subjectiveness of it. You go to your doctor and you say, I have these symptoms, and they don't show up in any tests. And some doctors will say, okay, well, I'm going to believe you and let's look into what we can do. And some doctors will not. And the same is true with some employers and some family members as well. If there's nothing coming up in your tests, then, well, maybe they're crazy, maybe they're making it up, maybe they're not as ill as we think. And the post-exertional malaise thing is obviously a whole extra thing on top of that, because it's not, this is showing up for me now. It's if I do this thing now, this is going to show up down the line in 24 hours and 48 hours. So is the CPET a way that we can sort of use to measure this in some way?
It is, and to kind of get a little bit into the CPET, but without getting too technical, which is kind of a challenge, but I will do my best. Think stationary bike. We have a person on the stationary bike with a mask and a tube connected to a computer, and the bike has electronic brakes on it, so we can make the pedals harder and easier to maneuver. And there's a whole setup, and there's EKG monitors on your chest and so forth. So there's kind of it's a whole thing. But the long and the short of a cardiopulmonary exercise test, at least in this regard, is that you pedal on the cycle ergometer, stationary bike, and it gets progressively harder during the task. Every minute it gets a little harder. And while you're pedaling, you're breathing into the mask and the tube, and we are collecting the breath, running the breath through the computer, and we're analyzing the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide in your breath. And from that data, plotting basically the composition of oxygen and carbon dioxide in your breath, we can determine when your body starts to shift away from using oxygen to burn fats and sugars. And so we call that the ventilatory anaerobic threshold. That's usually the point during exercise that you start to lose your breath. And as the exercise gets harder, you're not going to exercise that much longer after you've started to lose your breath. You'll have to stop. And over time, exercise intensities above losing your breath start to kind of defeat the process of burning fats and sugars using oxygen. Free oxygen radicals and lactate and all these chemicals come in and just start to gum up that process. It doesn't work very well. So there's some physiological reasons why it's hard to exercise above that level for very long. So we basically are looking for some maximal test criteria, and we do that on one day, and then 24 hours later, because remember there's a lag time here in terms of post-exertional symptoms and signs, we do another maximal cardiopulmonary exercise test when the person's in the post-exertional state. And so that measurement is more reflective of a person's post-exertional physiology than the first one where they walked in the door. So normally what we see in someone who's, say they're out of shape, right here, I could get to the gym more, and I don't. But that's a conversation for a different podcast, why the physio is not exercising. but normally, even though my markers on the first test might be low, suggesting that I'm deconditioned, I will be able to repeat those same markers on the second day. Or I might be able to even increase my performance a little bit because I have had the experience of the first CPET. I have learned like little biomechanical efficiencies. There's some motor learning that happens. And so I might even be able to actually increase my measurements. In people with ME or the ME subtype of long COVID, people living with long COVID and post-exertional malaise, they are not able to repeat the first test results on the second day. The second test results are lower. And what's most important here is that the results are most striking at that point where you start to lose your breath during exercise, what we call the ventilatory anaerobic threshold, that we have found by plotting your oxygen and carbon dioxide in your breath. You cannot fake that. You can't fake I guess maybe you could, but you'd have to take a ton of physiology and be very specific about that. So it's very, very difficult to fake. We'll say it's impossible. And so the test to submaximal exertion, people use less oxygen at that point and they put out less workload. than the first test. Again, this sort of unfakeable circumstance. And so what does this mean? Well, people don't generally like to function over the exertion where they lose their breath. It's uncomfortable. Like if I'm climbing stairs, I'm glad when I reach the top step because my muscles are burning and I've started to lose my breath. I'm not game for another flight. But so people don't generally function for very long above that point at which they lose their breath. And if you have less oxygen that you burn and less work output after you've already exerted, that sounds like a crash. That sounds like a crash because ultimately your functional ceiling, your functional metabolic ceiling has dropped and you can do less. So now, whereas maybe on the first day you're here, the second day you're down here. And so the first day you may have all these activities you could do. But now on the second day, you have all these activities you can do down here, but all these activities that you can't do. And so that's ultimately the utility of a 2-day cardiopulmonary exercise test. Now, it's not without challenges because we are aiming to provoke post-exertional malaise. That's sort of how the test works. It relies on people to come to a clinic. It requires a lot of specialized setup, commitment to keeping your equipment current, and lots of good stuff. So that even people who run well-known research centers aren't really set up to do this. And so there's only a few places around that can do it and do it well. But I will say that it's kind of the gold standard against which a lot of these other studies revealing differences between people with long COVID, ME, and controls can be assessed. So it's not like we don't have a measurement. We do have a measurement. It's just not ideal for a lot of people for a number of reasons. And many of these differences between, sort of people with long COVID and healthy participants, people are calling them potential biomarkers. Like I don't think there's a day that goes by that the B word isn't used. And that we have a new biomarker for long COVID, but yet we don't have an approved way to diagnose it. And so probably the way this is going to go is that most of these new technologies should be compared against a 2-day cardiopulmonary exercise test in order to really understand. And there are some challenges with that research design setup, but it is the best of what we have.
Yeah, and I think, like you say, there's the sort of eternal quest for biomarkers for something to prove in like data to show how bad you're feeling, because it's people with long COVID, and I'm sure the same for ME, chronic fatigue, they have no doubt in their mind how bad they feel. It's having to prove, if that's even the right word, to other people how bad they feel, which is kind of a sad state of affairs when sick people are having to prove that they're sick. But at the same time, I suppose from a research and a clinical perspective, if you can actually find something where you can see in the data, okay, that's a healthy person, that's a person with long COVID, that's different. It kind of gives you somewhere to go, okay, now I can stick a pin in that and maybe work out what I can do, kind of thing. So I suppose there is more than one side to the quote unquote proving.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you're exactly right. It would be great to have a blood test. It would be great to scan something and have it be definitive. We're just not there. That's not to say that haven't been a raft of studies that have turned up some potentially very meaningful differences in how people living with long COVID, how their bodies work. But we just haven't boiled that down into the test that allows us to differentiate people with long COVID versus people who are out of shape like me.
There's different subtypes of long COVID, and there's all sorts of chat into what they are and how they are different and how they present differently. But if we're looking for the one test, the one fingertip blood test that says yes, you have long COVID, I mean, maybe that's not practical if there's so many different types of long COVID. You mentioned the sort of ME subtype of long COVID, and that is absolutely one of them. But, within, you've still got loads of others, and they're probably all overlapping in some way as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. At the end of the day, there's going to be some splitting apart of subgroups. What I hope we don't do is challenge the legitimacy of a diagnosis based on the membership in a subgroup. It's not where we need to go with this. Trying to maintain a unified front is hard sometimes among folks with lived experience and the researchers who work with them, because how we allocate research funding is through a mechanism of splitting people apart to try and find the most granular commonality that we possibly can. So, if this was cancer research, we're not just giving money for cancer researchers, we're giving money for specific types of cancer. We have programs for different types. And so I don't think we're ever going to get away from that.
Yeah, the sort of practicalities and logistics and stuff is so difficult, I guess. Yeah.
Totally.
So we talked about pacing earlier, and that is, a huge strategy. Are there any other sort of strategies or things, for want of a better word, that you would sort of suggest for, firstly, avoiding post-exertional malaise in the first time, and then, what to do when we inevitably do get hit by it? What would you do to sort of minimize it and maybe work through it as quickly and painlessly as possible? And obviously, it's not possible to be completely painless.
Yeah, it's really hard. So the basics of a crash care plan are something that, as a clinician, I try and sort out pretty early on with people. So, things like resting, laying on your back with your feet up can help increase the amount of blood going to your heart. That can, ameliorate some of the issues that folks tend to have who have post-exertional malaise and regulation of their heart rates. Also using compression, especially lower extremity leg compression and compression of your tummy. The abdominal region tends to be pretty important. So basically squeezing that blood up to in the manner of sort of circulatory support. Hydration, using salt supplements, electrolyte drinks, because people with ME have been documented to have a lower plasma volume. So again, this is more circulatory support stuff. And I would say, again, just sort of developing this sense of what are those symptoms that are sort of my key limiting symptoms, and my key symptoms that I know that I'm entering a crash. Like this is starting to go sideways and I need to change things here. As well as the activities that tend to bring them on. So there are some things that you can do, in the manner of sort of interventions, and obviously any medications that you find helpful during a crash that have been prescribed by a physician, all together sort of as this crash care plan, and then just really sort of getting to know yourself and sort of where you're situated within the variability that is post-exertional malaise.
Yeah, I think I can't remember who it was, but there was someone who described something like long COVID as kind of having to relearn your new body. And I think, some of the things that are likely to trigger and those warning signs that are also important, and anything that you can do to intervene. Breathing was always my go-to. If I noticed my breath starting to speed up, that would be me going,
Yep, absolutely.
now is the time where I need to stop. I need to lie down. I need to do some breathing. And, obviously breathing is kind of my wheelhouse, but, there are many, many other strategies as well.
Yeah, and there's a whole thing we can say about, therapeutic breathing, that's a good point.
But yeah, absolutely, as you say. And I think having that prepared before it happens, I think as well, because when you're in that moment, when you're sort of spiraling down into that crash and you're sort of past the point of no return, you don't have the brain capacity to think, what do I do here? I'm a huge fan of lists. So I developed a list and I had my I can't remember what I called it, but it was my crash list. And then, when that happened, these were the things that I tried, and not all of them worked all the time, but they were there on paper for me when it did happen. So at least I had something to refer to rather than sort of just lying there going, oh my goodness, this is horrendous. I at least had something that I could try, I guess.
Maybe something that we can link in the show notes is the Bateman Horne Center's crash care plan.
Absolutely.
that folks might find useful, because it really does sort of lead through what are the things to have on hand, who are the people that may need to be contacted, having basic medical information together if someone needs to advocate for you. It's a very nicely constructed document that you can fill out, and let's make sure to have that available. That might be helpful for folks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Because then even if you do need to just hand it off to somebody else and say, this is the stuff, what needs done, here's the list. And you have that knowledge that someone's got you as well, I suppose. Because in that moment it is very scary when you're heading down that hole, so to speak. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure. And yeah, I think we need to come back and do round two at some point when we have the capacity. So yeah, thank you so much for giving up your time.
You and your listeners for having me. This has been fun. Hopefully it's been helpful information.
Thank you so much to all of my guests and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/longcovidpod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch. I'd love to hear from you.